Buenos días a todos y bienvenidos a este webinar coorganizado por Arpel y la empresa Sproule. Este webinar está abierto a socios y no socios de Arpel, entonces en unas breves palabras eh, les quiero comentar para los que no conocen a Arpel, que es la Asociación de Empresas de Petróleo, Gas y Energía Renovable de América Latina y el Caribe. Nucleamos a empresas operadoras y proveedoras que operan en realidad en más de 30 países de América Latina. Yo soy Tiffen Lemuener, estoy a cargo del vector estratégico de excelencia operacional. Esta serie de de 2 webinars que estamos coorganizando con la empresa Sproule, tiene que ver con otro vector estratégico que tenemos dentro de la asociación y que estamos impulsando fuertemente este año, que es el vector de transiciones energéticas. De hecho, a fines de abril, con nuestro socio ANCAP, organizamos un evento acá en Montevideo sobre descarbonización y transiciones energéticas y se lanzó el Comité de Transiciones Energéticas. Entonces, para seguir con todo este movimiento que estamos impulsando, porque sabemos que nuestra industria es una industria de alto impacto y cada acción que podemos hacer tiene un efecto importante. Sabemos también que se va a seguir a corto y mediano y probablemente un poco más largo plazo, se va a seguir necesitando gas y petróleo, y entonces tenemos que encontrar maneras de descarbonizar. Bueno, dentro de este marco viene esta serie de webinar que son 2 partes. La primera parte es hoy sobre captura, utilización y almacenamiento de carbono. Bueno, el acrónimo en inglés es CCUS, queda mucho más corto. Y la segunda parte será en 2 semanas, mismo día, misma hora, es decir, el jueves 1 de junio a las 12 horas de Argentina y Uruguay, sobre geotermia. El webinar de hoy, entonces el título es Liberando el potencial de CCUS en América Latina, aprovechando décadas de conocimiento de reservorios. Voy a hacer una breve introducción y después presentar a Richard. Entonces, la captura, utilización y almacenamiento de carbono, como dije, se está convirtiendo en un componente crítico para que cualquier país o industria lo considere como parte de una estrategia general para mitigar las emisiones. Entonces, vamos a hablar de esto y de todo lo que ya está en América Latina para permitir impulsar el CCUS en la región. Richard Hers, que va a ser nuestro speaker, es actualmente gerente en gestión de carbono en Sproule, donde administra el área de prácticas en gestión de carbono y ayuda a los clientes a trazar los caminos hacia un futuro de 0 emisiones netas. Tiene experiencia en la cartografía del potencial de almacenamiento geológico en el oeste de Canadá, brindando información sobre los recursos de almacenamiento de CO2 requeridos para respaldar futuros productos de baja intensidad de carbono. Y desarrollo de herramientas de referencias globales para CCUS a través de proyectos de investigación de la industria con la Universidad de Calgary. Sí, no lo dije, pero Richard está basado en Calgary, Canadá. Richard tiene más de 12 años de experiencia en evaluación y desarrollo de recursos como ingeniero petrolero y de almacenamiento geológico, habiendo trabajado tanto en Canadá como en Reino Unido, y Richard finalmente tiene una maestría en desarrollo de energía sostenible. A nivel logística, lo que me olvidé decir, y que por suerte mi compañera puso en el chat, es que contamos con interpretación simultánea, porque Richard va a hablar en inglés, yo voy a hablar en español. Entonces, abajo de la interfaz de Zoom tienen un globito que se parece a un mapamundi, vamos a decir, que dice interpretación, y ahí pueden mantenerse en el canal original, entonces escuchando en español, cuando sea en español, en inglés, cuando sea en inglés, o elegir Spanish o English según el idioma que prefieren. Eso lo voy a decir en inglés también por si hay asistencia que no habla español. Yeah, I forgot to say that at the beginning of the webinar, but we have simultaneous interpretation. So at the bottom of the Zoom interface, you have an icon and you can access interpretation, and you have to choose the English canal. So you will hear when I speak Spanish, you will hear the translation to English. And when Richard speaks English, well, you will hear English. Okay, so that was for the interpretation. Eso era para la interpretación simultánea. La otra cosa logística que quiero mencionar es que la presentación de Richard va a durar aproximadamente media hora, y que vamos a contar con media hora de espacio para preguntas y respuestas. Pueden hacer sus preguntas y respuestas usando también el icono de Q&A que está abajo de la interfaz de Zoom. Yo lo pueden hacer en el idioma que se sienten más cómodo, solamente dentro de los tres que hablo, es decir, inglés y español, si puede ser, y también si realmente insisten pueden hacerlo en francés, que también voy a manejar eso, pero idealmente inglés y español. Creo que no tengo nada que agregar, entonces Richard, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here today to talk about such an important topic. My name is Richard Harris. I lead the carbon management practice at a global energy advisory called Sproule. My role is advising clients primarily on the technical and commercial aspects of carbon management, specifically related to CO2 storage, CO2 sequestration, enhanced oil recovery. So today I'd like to first go through a bit about Sproule very quickly, touch on some key concepts in geological CO2 storage, sort of a state of play in the energy transition in Latin America, comment on where CCUS fits in the energy transition, the challenges to the advancement of CCS in Latin America, how Latin America can leverage legacy reservoir knowledge. A quick case study on Brazil. We'll talk about financing and commercial markets. This is a key bit and a key barrier to the advancement of CO2 storage, so it's worth commenting on that. And then next steps in Latin America, how I see and how Sproule sees momentum building in Latin America, and where we see the next few years, and then finally some concluding comments. Our practice at Sproule is broken into 4 departments: energy advisory, which is where the carbon management group resides, reservoir services, which is reservoir characterization, reserve certification. We have a geothermal advisory department, and we'll be presenting on that in the coming months. And then we have an asset management group that has oil and gas assets under management. I'm based in Calgary, but we have offices in Denver, Houston, Mexico City, and The Hague, so we truly are a global consultancy. So I wanted to start by just briefly going over what CCS is, or what CCUS is, So it starts in the CO2 capture phase. So this is capturing CO2 from stationary emission sources. Capture technologies can range from absorption, like amine-based systems, which is typically what we have historically implemented. And I say historically, oil and gas industry have used amine scrubbers since the 60s and 70s. So it's not new technology. That technology is evolving with next generation amine absorbents, which have a lower energy penalty and are more efficient. Then there's adsorbent systems or membrane type systems, and new novel capture technologies, all of which have been or either been implemented or in the stages of technology readiness advancement. So at either lab stage to commercial readiness. Once the CO2 is being captured, CO2 is then it's either compressed or dehydrated, then compressed. Then that CO2 is then transported via pipeline, ship, or even truck to a storage site. Once it's at the storage site, the CO2 is injected into the subsurface, either for permanent CO2 storage, or in the case of the utilization, or the U in CCUS, it is injected in order to enhance oil recovery, improve incremental oil recovery. So in that case, you would see CO2 would be recycled. It would then be separated and then recompressed and injected again. So the types of geological storage and some geological considerations. So to simplify it, there's three types of geological storage. The first is into deep saline aquifers. This is you would inject CO2 for permanent storage in this case. The use for CO2 enhanced oil recovery, and I spoke briefly on that the last slide. And then finally is injected into depleted oil and gas reservoirs of significant importance in Latin America, given the legacy oil and gas production and knowledge. There's several important criteria to consider. Capacity, this is the amount of CO2 you can store in the reservoir. Injectivity, how much CO2 can you inject into the reservoir, and then containment. This is, it's imperative in CO2 storage operations that you provide secure containment, and you can demonstrate to the regulators that the CO2 you inject into the reservoir stays where you say it's going to. Finding the right reservoir, you need a number of reservoir parameters, reservoir pressure, temperature, porosity, permeability, thickness, and so on. All of these parameters are almost identical to reservoir characterization properties required for evaluating oil and gas reservoirs. So these types of concepts, these parameters are not unfamiliar to the oil and gas industry. The industry has been evaluating these types of parameters for decades and decades and decades. So energy transition in Latin America. So first let's comment on the role of CCUS. And I think I've just pulled the stat from the IEA stating that CCUS will have to contribute 15% reduction to emissions to reach their net zero scenario goals in their sustainable development scenario. There are other studies out there that provide a similar number. The point of this statement is that CCS is a necessary tool, and then there's consensus on that. It's a necessary tool to reach not only national but global CO2 reduction goals. Latin America accounts for 9% of the global CO2 emissions. It's not small, but it's not large either. And it's definitely something that needs to be tackled in Latin America. Also relevant, Latin America contributed 9% of the global market oil production in 2022, which is also significant. Although there is a growing consensus that oil demand will drop, I don't think, and Sproule doesn't believe it's going to go away overnight, and it's a necessary resource for Latin America. The key question is how can you both reduce emissions and maintain a focus on oil production. Latin America countries and companies have made commitments to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. A number of Latin American companies have made net zero pledges. A number of Latin American companies, most recently, I think Ecopetrol, made a net zero pledge by 2050. So those targets and mandates are being set currently. And we believe that there is CCS technology is one of those key levers in reaching a net zero goal or a decarbonization goal, and Latin America is well suited to exploit that. So what are the challenges to advancement in CCUS in Latin America? I should note here that although these do apply to Latin America, these are not unique to Latin America. Many countries, if not all countries, that have pursued carbon capture and storage over the last decade or more have encountered these challenges or barriers. So the first is understanding your CO2 storage resource. In countries that have legacy oil and gas production, and this question becomes much easier to answer. There are wellbore penetrations, there's seismic data, there's countless amounts of reservoir characterization, core data, well logs, these types of things that have been occurring in pursuit of oil and gas that can be levered to help identify CO2 storage potential, both in saline aquifers and in depleted oil and gas pools. We're seeing greater and greater amount of maturity in the oil and gas reservoirs in Latin America. Some countries more than others. There are notably Guyana, Brazil actually are increasing oil production, but most oil producing nations in Latin America oil production is declining. Lack of regulatory frameworks and capacity. This happens everywhere at the initial stages. There needs to be clear, concise regulations and policy in place to provide guidance to companies looking to explore carbon capture and storage. What this ultimately means is, well, it's not too dissimilar to oil and gas, and the one thing oil and gas companies hate is uncertainty when it comes to policy and price. The more governments can remove that uncertainty, the better for carbon capture and storage projects. High cost. Carbon capture and storage is not cheap, and it requires significant pricing incentives, grants, access to carbon markets, all to mitigate the costs and make these projects commercial. The reason that we've only seen this boom in carbon capture and storage projects globally in the last 5 years is because of levers that have presented themselves related to reducing or mitigating costs, either through tax breaks, direct grants, that type of thing. Financing is a huge challenge. So access to financing in Latin America is critical for future projects. Limited public awareness. Talks like this, engaging with the public and communities in which your projects are operating, understanding about the CO2 molecule, understanding about oil and gas reservoirs, all of these things will help reduce that barrier to CCUS project development. and lack of infrastructure. It's not like there are massive CO2 hubs and CO2 pipeline networks running across Latin America. These types of things need to be considered in a nationwide, if not a region-wide basis, to help reduce that risk. So oil and gas industry is uniquely positioned to solve this problem. As I discussed earlier, there are lots of mature reservoirs which offer pore space to stick CO2 in Latin America. CO2 is a proven technology. CO2 carbon capture has been happening since the 60s and 70s in the United States. CO2 enhanced oil recovery has been happening since the same time frame. This is not a new technology. What's new about it is that we are injecting CO2 now into more often now into saline aquifers, which are less well characterized than traditional oil and gas fields. We've got to use existing infrastructure. Just because we don't have large infrastructure, dedicated CO2 storage infrastructure networks, doesn't mean we can't leverage the existing gas fields, existing well bores to support CO2 storage projects. The last bit here, and I'll talk to this on the next couple of slides, is enhanced oil recovery potential. We see enhanced oil recovery as this key stepping stone for regions like Latin America and elsewhere, even North America, before the incentives and levers are there to really motivate and promote CCUS. The advantages of enhanced oil recovery is that you provide revenue directly from the incremental oil that you produce, which can offset the cost of the carbon capture and transportation of the CO2. So here's a quick comparison of CO2 enhanced oil recovery versus CCS, and by CCS here I mean the permanent geological storage of CO2. Enhanced oil recovery is profit driven, whereas CCS, the revenue is generated from tax or offset credits generated by the CO2 stored. Both a multi-phase flow, what I mean by that is you're dealing with both CO2 and water and oil in the case of enhanced oil recovery in the reservoir. Enhanced oil recovery, you're dealing with injection and production wells. You're just dealing with injection wells in the permanent geological storage. CO2 is separated, produced, separated, and reinjected in the EOR case, whereas it's just captured and injected in the permanent geological storage. CO2 is typically purchased in the enhanced oil recovery process, whereas CO2 is captured and injected in the CCS case. And finally, there is this lingering acceptability issue on CO2 enhanced oil recovery. As ESG pressures are mounting on oil and gas companies and emitters, whether they want to be tied to an enhanced oil recovery project where incremental oil is one of the byproducts, is still a contentious issue in some places. The long and short of it is utilization, we believe, is crucial to making CCS economically viable. And CO2 EOR is one of the only mature, scalable utilization options there is available for CCUS projects. Latin America is uniquely positioned given its world-class geological storage potential, mature reservoirs. That we believe it's got an opportunity to be a world leader. So here's just I pulled this list of CO2 screening criteria from an industry standard checklist. Point of this slide is really to demonstrate that legacy oil and gas knowledge, ticks most boxes when it comes to site identification and characterization for CO2 storage. When you looking at primary seals, seismic data, well logs, you name it, pressure data, this is the type of data that oil and gas companies have been collecting on reservoirs for decades and decades and decades. The same goes for the characterization of the storage unit and the confining strata. So all this data, or the majority of this data, either is available or there can be acquired through methods that have been proven in the oil and gas industry for decades. Here's a case study on the Parana Basin in Brazil. It's been studied a fair bit, and this is just an example of the types of regional studies that need to happen to further de-risk CO2 storage potential on a regional scale before we dive down into a more specific site-specific level. This study in particular, actually several studies, was looking at this area around the Parana Basin, looking at the density of CO2 emitting, stationary CO2 emitting sources, and was looking to evaluate what the CO2 storage potential was in this basin. Like ultimately, the study found that there was a number of the key critical criteria this basin was able to demonstrate that it had. It also demonstrated that this basin has more than enough storage potential to support emissions in that region. And we're not talking about a small amount of emissions. In that cluster of emissions, we're talking about over 400 million tons per annum of CO2. So it's studies like this that to help de-risk and accelerate our understanding on more regional basis need to occur to help progress site level understanding. The other thing I note is that the reason onshore here is more attractive than perhaps the Campos or Santos basins. Those are offshore, and logistically transporting CO2 offshore is obviously more challenging and more costly. So Latin America and the pricing instruments, there has really been in the last decade a real advancement in Latin American countries exploring carbon markets, carbon pricing instruments. You can see here on this chart that there's a number of countries in the last decade implementing various carbon price instruments and mechanisms. They range in Latin America between carbon taxes, emissions trading schemes, ETS emissions trading schemes, as well as a combination of either. I think one commonality, though, is if you look at the carbon tax price versus the signal, and I've just pulled what the EU ETS allowance is for, I've just picked the data in May versus Canada. This is, mind you, this is all in US equivalent. You can see that the signal is a fair bit different, right? Most or all of the Latin American carbon taxes are less than $10 a ton, whereas Canada, we're at equivalent about $50 a ton and about $50 a ton EU. So there is quite this difference in the price of carbon, and what it will result in is a different signal. So that the prices of abatement or marginal cost of abatement for CO2 is much higher than this $10 a ton. And you've seen that actually with the implementation of 45Q, or the tax credit in the States. That is, with the implementation and enhancement of that at the end of last year, there's been a flurry of CO2 projects that have been announced since then. And what this indicates is that you do need strong price incentives, CO2 price incentives to stimulate CCUS projects. There's a huge opportunity in Latin America to use the carbon markets and carbon pricing instruments to facilitate growth in CCS projects. Carbon markets can facilitate investments in CCS projects, allowing businesses to generate revenue. So this generating revenue is the key bit of it. The key bit, monetization bit, is one of the key risks of CO2 CCS projects. The challenge here across Latin America is there's no current compliance instrument like a carbon offset to help monetize CO2 sequestered through CCS. So this is a big gap right now in the deployment of in the advancement of CO2 storage projects across Latin America. So there's some examples from other regions. The EU Innovation Fund is this grant program for money generated from the sale of the EU ETS allowances. They've allocated 1.8 billion euros to 15 large-scale projects, 7 of which are CCS. Point being here is there's a large pool of money in Europe for CCS projects and low-carbon projects. Also, there's, depending on the country, there are also more regional or local grants that are available. I've just pulled the one example of Norwegian Longship. So this project, 2/3 of the project was covered by the Norwegian state. So there's a huge amount of investment from both the country level governments. In Canada, there's a number of incentives from carbon offset protocols, credit generation opportunities, investment tax credits, contracts for difference. So this recently came into play earlier this year, where the government is guaranteeing a price of CO2 to help, and I mentioned uncertainty before, is to help remove that uncertainty from CO2 project and project developers. There's a large amount of grant funding. There's a large historic investment in CO2 storage projects. So two of the more famous ones in Canada, Shell Quest and Boundary Dam, both of these projects received several hundred million or millions and hundreds of millions of dollars in grant funding. This public-private partnership and having public ownership in CCS project is one of those ways to help reduce and promote these projects. USA, I mentioned earlier, 45Q. There's a number of incentives, tax incentives, and now, as of the end of last year, direct pay to CCS project developers to help alleviate the cost of carbon capture and storage cost. Again, there's a lot of money at play here. The DOE has announced that they've got $2.5 billion to advance carbon capture and storage projects. The common theme across all three of these jurisdictions is it takes a bit of sticks, it takes a bit of carrots, so it takes a bit of incentives, penalization too, as well as the support from government. You see that in all three of those jurisdictions. Lessons learned from North America. CCS projects are perceived as high risk because of regulatory uncertainty. And there's one thing oil and gas companies hate, same with CCS project developers, is regulatory uncertainty and price uncertainty. So that is still a key consideration of risk in North America. Financing risk, uncertainty due to CO2 storage supply, tax credits. So this is a really interesting part of carbon capture and storage. If you're a project developer, you want to ensure, and your project is tied to, for example, an ethanol plant, you want to ensure that ethanol, that the price of ethanol is going to stay strong enough that your CO2 supply is not impacted by that upstream supply of CO2. So there's a whole value chain that you need to look at when it comes to project development and project financing. Lack of capacity and understanding at government agencies. This is happening at the EPA right now. It's taking 1.5 years, if not 2 years, to get a Class 6 or injection well permit through. It's a recognition that governments need to build up resources to support these projects and align themselves with project developers. Limited data on saline aquifers, and this is for a good reason. Oil and gas companies have not explored for oil and gas with the intention of looking for saline aquifers. There are inherently less well penetrations in saline aquifers because that's not what oil and gas companies have been targeting. So there is this lack of understanding in saline aquifers. Emphasizes safety and caution. This is critical in these early stages of carbon capture and storage project development, where we need the confidence of regulators, governments, and the communities that we are developing in. There's no margin for error for screwing up, so we need to be very conscious of safety and the containment aspects of CO2. Certain CO2 sources are more profitable than others, and this comes back to enhanced oil recovery. Perhaps enhanced oil recovery is this stepping stone for Latin America and other countries to provide revenue until there are sufficient policies and fiscal or financial instruments in place to support permanent geological storage. And then just a comment on 45Q, there are just over 160, I believe, last I looked, CO2 storage projects that have been announced or that are operating or announced in the US right now. That number a year ago, I think, was less than 50, or a year or two ago was less than 50. This is all down to this 45Q tax credit. And I shouldn't just say all down to that, and effort by the Department of Energy to invest in demonstration projects and invest in advancing the commercialization of CO2 storage. So building momentum. So it's not all, the picture is quite rosy for Latin America. There's been many, and this is only a sample, but there's been many large policy and study announcements throughout Latin America in the last 3 years. Chile in end of 2021 announced a strategy to promote the adoption of CCS technologies in energy. Mexico did the same thing, similar thing in December of 2021. Colombia at the beginning of 2022 aimed to announced regulations with the aim to incentivize investment in CCS technologies. Brazil announced a national plan for carbon capture and storage, again aiming to promote the development of these development of CCS technologies. A critical one here, World Bank announced in April 2022 a project to help Latin American countries understand carbon markets and how they can use carbon markets to help promote and develop CCS policies and projects. Colombia announced in February of this year through the regulator ANH that they were going to be preparing inputs and support to look at public policy requirements to advance geothermal, wind, hydrogen, and carbon capture and storage, as well as specifically looking at how can we use, and this talk revolves around how can we use the pore space. This is specifically what ANH is looking at. How can we use the pore space effectively to help the energy transition, right? And then most recently, Brazil announced in April this year that they're going to hire a consultant to look at the development of their underground storage and exploiting their underground storage. So there's been a flurry of announcements here in the last couple of years, all building momentum. And this really checks that first box is trying to understand initially what resources do you have? What regionally do you have for CO2 storage resource? Where is that? And how best can you exploit that resource, because it truly is that pore space, and it is a resource now, and it does require a bit of changing mindset. Like my belief and way I explain it to clients of ours is that, yeah, this pore space, it used just to be, you know, the oil and gas that was contained in the pore space. Now the actual pore space has value, because now that space can occupy CO2. So in conclusion, there's a significant potential for CO2 storage development in Latin America. There is a large amount of depleted oil and gas pools and pore space. It just requires the effort to further de-risk it, to help quantify that opportunity. There's valuable data through legacy oil and gas production and operation for assessing these storage opportunities. Unfortunately, due to the high cost and lack of incentives in Latin America, there are few CCS projects that have achieved commercial success. Financing is a major challenge. Investors are really looking for certainty and longevity in their investment, and right now that is it is uncertain in Latin America. There's lots to be learning from North America, Europe, Australia, countries that have more mature CCS project experience. I believe it's truly going to take a more collaborative approach amongst Latin American countries, whether it be a group carbon market or shared infrastructure, those types of things to help produce the sort of economies of scale required to really get these projects off the ground. And to fully unlock this, there needs to be this hand-in-hand collaborative partnership between private industry and government. And I think you've seen time and time again over the last decade that the projects that get executed are the ones that have government support, both through fiscal support as well as support from a robust and certain regulatory environment. And then my final point, it all starts in the subsurface. You need to understand the rocks and the storage potential of the rocks, the risk, before you can start thinking about anything else. Yeah, with that, I'll take questions. Yeah, thanks again, and I appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you, Richard. Just to remember to everyone that you have a simultaneous interpretation available from English to Spanish in the interpretation icon. And y de español a inglés tienen interpretación simultánea disponible en el iconito abajo del interfaz de Zoom. I don't know if I will speak English or Spanish, because actually I have quite a few. All the questions are in English for you. A lot of questions about financing. Yeah, so I won't read one in specifically, but I can see that there are quite a few. We have like 20 questions, so we won't have time to answer all of them, but after the webinar, I will send all the questions to Richard and to Sproule, so be sure that your questions will be answered. So we have like three main subjects in the questions I can see. So financing, especially in America Latina, in Latin America, sorry. Regulation. Did you study regulations in the several countries, and how can that affect the CCUS projects? And also about more on the technical aspect about the containment, to ensure the containment and well, I will read this one because I should remember exactly. Considering that for permanent storage of CO2, the containment assurance is a key factor, which is the suggested recommended monitoring time frame to ensure this containment. So maybe we can start with this one.
Yeah, I was going to suggest I'll start with the containment question. It could be a subject of a whole new presentation, a whole hour presentation. Absolutely, and containment. And in fact, if you go back to that slide of where I talk about the three key parameters of storage capacity, injectivity, containment. Containment is by far, in my opinion, the most important, and that's recognized by most developed regulators. Like for example, in the U.S. And this goes back 10 years now, when the EPA first outlined their Class 6 injection well permits. There is robust monitoring plans that need to be presented, both to get your Class 6 well permits, but as well to receive your tax credit, your 45Q tax credit. You need to submit a measurement reporting and verification report outlining the risks with regards to CO2 plume evolution, but that needs to be updated and submitted on a regular basis as a kind of an adaptable, ongoing document. The monitoring programs, and this is where legacy oil and gas knowledge and methods are important. Things like reservoir simulation, and this is a lot of the work we do to identify scenarios in which CO2 may migrate to certain areas. We need to understand where, based on that modeling, where to position monitoring wells, for example, so we can evaluate whether through sampling, pressure sampling, temperature sampling, where that plume is moving and how is it moving, so that data can be communicated to the regulators. So that's an example of a type of guidance and regulation that needs to be in place, like in Latin America, to help kind of support CO2 storage projects. Oh, and then so the finance question.
Yes, I mean, yeah, there are a lot of questions about how we may finance those projects in the region.
So there's, I think it comes down to, I'm going to simplify it here. It comes down to one key driver to me, and it is generating high quality offset credits. Now, Latin America, the carbon market in the voluntary carbon market in Latin America is blown up. It's quite mature now. I say mature in the last few years, producing offset credits generated from forestry projects. There isn't, as far as I'm aware, there isn't a single carbon capture and storage project or geological storage project that has been generating CO2 credits sold on the voluntary market in Latin America. So what needs to happen, there needs to be a financial instrument in place where there can be a high quality offset credit can be generated from a CO2 storage project, and there needs to be a market, whether that be a regional market, that can provide some certainty to the value of that credit. Like we know that the cost of carbon capture and storage, depending on what depending on what the emission source is and distance to the sequestration site, it can be anywhere from, say, slightly less than $50 a ton US to, it could be over $200 a ton US. To offset that price, you need to have carbon price signal that is of that or more to start generating revenue from for these projects. And anyone investing in these projects wants to see that kind of certainty, right? And it's actually it's what's driving the amount of development in the US, is because now as of end of last year, when the government has extended the 45Q tax credit, and it has allowed smaller emitters access to that credit, that's really what has been the catalyst for CO2 storage project developments. And it all comes back down to financing. The financing question all comes back to kind of certainty in generating revenue, and that is tied to CO2 price, and whether that can be generated through offset or tax or tax equity in the case of the states that can be then sold on the equity market. If those types, and you need to have those mechanisms in place to start that question with potential financiers.
Okay. See, we only have 5 minutes left, okay, and like 24 questions. So
yeah, I'm happy to answer them over email after, if that's the case.
Yeah, so the other big question was on is there any regulations? All right, maybe you already answered that in your presentation. Sorry, I don't remember, because in the region on CCUS.
So the way CCS is handled right now in the region is through oil and gas regulations. What's not in place, which needs to be in place, is like a carbon or CO2 offset protocol, which outlines and provides guidance to how to quantify, store, and verify the CO2 that is going in the ground, is staying in the ground, and that CO2 then can be verified and certified by a third party, ultimately creating value for that ton of CO2 that eventually could be sold.
Mm-hmm. Maybe one last question that is technical. Es en español. ¿Cuáles son las tecnologías más maduras? What kind of technology are more mature for CCUS? Well, is there any mature technology?
I presume the question's about capture technologies. The capture technologies, the most mature capture technologies are amine-based absorption systems that oil and gas industry has been using for decades and decades and decades to separate CO2 from natural gas streams.
Yes.
What has changed in the last 5-10 years is scientists are getting clever with new generation amines that require less energy to regenerate or separate the CO2 from the amine once it's adhered to the amine. It's one of the key challenges for capture, and this is why capture, for the most part, is so expensive. It is incredibly energy intensive to separate the CO2 from the amine molecule. So any advancements in materials or chemicals that require less energy to both capture and separate that CO2 will help reduce the cost of capture.
I'm sorry, that's a question from me. I mean, because actually, yeah, CO2 capture using amine is used like for a long time. But the new thing is also acting on the combustion, no? CO2 capturing the CO2 from the
direct air capture.
Yeah, from the combustion.
Okay, yes.
Fuel. No, that's the question from me. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's quite
hacking the attendees.
Yeah, that's quite right. So direct air capture, and I didn't touch on direct air capture, but direct air capture is, yeah, it's coming. There are probably a handful of direct air capture technology providers across the globe right now.
That's not mature yet.
It's not. The technology is mature. The route to commercialization is difficult. Having said that, I've heard evidence of CO2 offset credits attributed to direct air capture. So this is CO2 that's been captured from direct air capture and geologically sequestered underground, reaching a price of, I heard, up to $1,400 a ton. So there could be this small but large market, small but valuable market for CO2, for high quality CO2 storage, CO2 offset credits generated from direct air capture.
We will have to stop because we have completed the hour. We have like 25 questions, so I think we have demonstrated today that it's a really interesting subject, even for the region, and all the challenges of financing, of regulation, and also we have quite a few questions. It's true that Latin America is not the most intensive emitters of CO2 in CO2 emissions, so there is this question of fair energy transition. Also, yeah. Well, a lot of issues and topics here. I will switch to Spanish to conclude.
The only thing I'll add there is, and I didn't really touch on this, there absolutely has to be support from international multilaterals, agencies to help finance CCS projects in Latin America. I think that is probably a necessity.
Okay. So muchas gracias, Richard, for this. Sorry, I have a language mixed. Muchas gracias a todos de haber estado escuchando esta presentación, que espero que fue de su interés. Parece que sí, por la cantidad de preguntas que tenemos, que las voy a mandar por email a Richard, que va a intentar poder contestar a todas de manera satisfactoria. La grabación de este webinar estará disponible en el canal de YouTube de Arpel, y les vamos a mandar también la presentación de Richard por email. Y dentro de Arpel, dentro de la asociación, como ya dije al principio, transiciones energéticas, cambio climático. Cambio climático es un tema que se viene trabajando desde hace años. Este año se lanzó un comité específico de transiciones energéticas. Va a haber Ya hubo este año una acción muy fuerte sobre descarbonización, entonces invitó a todas las empresas, bueno, socias que no son parte de este comité, a acercarse, obviamente, a Arpel, y las empresas que no son socias también acercarse a Arpel para trabajar, cooperar con toda la industria regional para, bueno, hacer lo que podemos desde nuestra industria, que como dije al principio, sabemos es de alto impacto en el medio ambiente, para ayudar a cumplir con las metas y mitigar los efectos, reducir nuestras emisiones. Agradezco a todos y bueno, nos vemos para el próximo webinar que hacemos en conjunto con Sproule sobre geotermia, que también geotermia es otro tema, una energía limpia, pero que usa competencias de nuestra industria. Entonces, que eso también es interesante en el término de usar competencias que ya existen en la industria y cómo transformarlas y usarlas en energías limpias, porque es otro tema también del talento humano que tenemos. Entonces, agradezco a todos y nos vemos en 15 días. Thank you, Richard. And we are in contact. I will send you the 31 questions that we have now.